Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to my latest live stream. If you'd be so kind as to say hello in the chat, give us some comments, let me know that you can hear me okay. That means I've got some feedback to know that this system is working. Of course, the LinkedIn live stream, there's about 30 to 60 seconds of delay between what I say and what comes out of your computer screen. So of course there's going to be a bit of a lag there, so please be mindful of that. And of course, welcome to my fourth live stream. So this is the fourth in a series of live streams where I'm preparing for a case study that I will be delivering at the Cranfield Safety Investigation course in early March. Of course, so I'll just quickly share my screen so you can see some details about that. There we go, look at that, fantastic. It's on the wrong side of the screen, so let's put it over there. There we go. So this is the Analysis Techniques for Accident Investigators course. I've been contributing to that course for a number of times since 2019 now, so it's quite a few years since I've been doing it. But of course, it's happening on the 2nd to the 6th of March. Let's just zoom in so you can see that a little bit. 2nd to the 6th of March 2026. It's going to be led by Janos and Craig Cattle, Janos Rosa and Craig Cattle. So of course, if you've got any questions about that, please refer to those guys. And of course, what I'm doing today is essentially preparing for that. So we're going to go through and talk about the Garuda Indonesia flight GA152 accident, which involved an Airbus A300 B4 in September 1997. I have included the links to the previous live streams in the comments. So of course, if you want to go and watch those previous live streams, you're welcome to do that. Now I'm anticipating today that I should be able to get through the rest of the report today. Hopefully, fingers crossed. I'm going to go for about an hour, 90 minutes, something like that, see how far we get to. And of course, if you've got any questions, comments, or you've got some experience that you'd like to share, please stick them in the chat and contribute. It'd be awesome. I'd like to see your involvement in this live stream. So with that said, let's get stuck into it. Let's just see if we've got any comments first. So, Manuel, hi, good to see you there. Thank you for coming along. That's fantastic. Well, looking forward to speaking to you. So yeah, everything seems to be working. Got some levels, some voice going through. So let's give it a whirl. Okay, so where did we get up to last time? So we got up to section 2.7, median approach controller. So we'll continue from there. That's page 37, and we've got page 43. So a few pages there to get through to finish section 2, and then section 3 conclusions is it's 2 pages, so we should be able to get through that pretty quick. There might be a lot of thinking and talking about this because obviously these are the findings and conclusions of someone else's investigation, and of course I'm looking at this through the lens of what stamp cast type of investigation could bring you. So there's a few comments that will come out of that mindset, out of that lens, if you like. And then, of course, there's some recommendations, and we can talk about those. And if there's anything, really interesting from a stamp perspective. Excuse me. And then, of course, there is the appendices with all the various photos and all that kind of good stuff. So let's carry on then. So there we go. So Medan approach control. Let's make sure that's big enough on the screen for you to be able to read. Fantastic. We've got 4 viewers. Hello, viewers. Please say hello. Tell me in the chat where you're watching in from, if that's a term. And we'll try and make this as straightforward as we can. A bit of entertainment, even though it is a serious subject. It's important to sort of balance that energy. So here we go. Medan approach controller. So first off, when we're talking about the Medan approach controller, logically that is a candidate controller that we would want to include in our safety control structure model. And so let's just have a look. We did start to build a control structure model the other day. There we go. So we've already got one for Medan approach controller. So I'm not going to suggest that we create another one. But what I'll do is I'll steal this candidate controller and I'll put it over here in case I want to add any detail to that as a local sort of little model, if you like. So first off, we've got a mention of an incorrect call sign. So we could say, well, that could be a type of control action, perhaps, or part of a control action. So I'm just going to steal this arrow over here so I don't have to format it again. Oh, no, I don't want to do that, Simon. That won't be very good. Right, let's stick this arrow on here. There we go. And then we'll delete the text that's on it because it's irrelevant for this. And in fact, what I'll do is I'll move some of these pages out of the way so we've got a bit of a workspace to work on, because there's a chance that we're going to start writing some more detail on this. So let's just put that over there. And as I say, when you're doing this yourself, I do recommend using an infinite whiteboard type tool. This one I'm using is called Miro or Miro. I don't know how to pronounce it properly. But I find this is quite useful, especially when you're working with multiple people, especially when you're working remotely. So being able to have a tool where you can work together, like this is very helpful. I mean, of course, you could use whiteboard, you could use post-it notes, but of course, this will enable you to work faster and also be able to do it remotely, which is always good when you've got a big team. So Meaden approach controller. So there's an incorrect call sign there. So they've either provided an incorrect call sign or they've received one from elsewhere. So we'll put the feedback, the beginnings of a feedback loop. And as I say, the general convention for building these control structure models is you have control actions pointing downwards and feedback arrows, feedback paths pointing upwards. Now, of course, it depends on your style, how you want to model it, but that's the general convention that most people use. And it's really important that once you start with a general convention for how you model these things, I highly recommend, I can't recommend it enough, that you stick with a standard approach. Because if you're inconsistent in your approach, you will start to confuse yourself and tie yourself in knots later on. And of course, when you're trying to communicate this model to an audience who are not necessarily familiar with how to do a control structure model and all the different technical language and vocabulary, you want to make the diagrams as simple and straightforward as possible so you can communicate a message and they're not questioning and asking lots of irrelevant questions, because of the way you've modeled things. So I typically have the down arrows, the control actions on the left, and on the right I'll typically have the feedback arrows pointing upwards. So I have an anti-clockwise sort of flow around that control loop. But that's just personal preference. That's what I've used over the years, and I don't really see a need to change it. I think it would probably confuse me more than anything. So when you're doing these models, I do recommend stick to a convention and try and maintain it throughout your models. And of course, it's also sort of implicit that you systemize it across your organization, so that if you've got multiple people in your organization doing this and perhaps they bring their work together or present it in different reports, I'd suggest that you have the same basic approach to drawing these models, so it's a lot easier on the organizations and sharing knowledge and experience. Okay, so with all of that said, let's talk about the actual controller then itself. So the Merpati 152 flight earlier in the morning that day, and Merpati 153 and Indonesia 153 flights within 30 minutes prior to the accident in the same ATS route. In the earlier parts of the CVR, cockpit voice recorder recording, exchanges in the cockpit expressed the flight crew's concern regarding the similar call sign. Okay, so from thinking about the flight crew themselves, their mental models, their beliefs, they've recognized that there's a potential for there is a similar call sign, and so they may be preparing themselves to listen more carefully or, try and mitigate that. So they're primed for it. Although it cannot be classified as a causal factor. Okay, let me... I'm going to talk about this in a minute. Let me just read through it. So, although it cannot be classified as a causal factor, the incorrect call sign might have been the beginning of subsequent events ultimately leading towards the occurrence of the accident. Okay. So I'm just going to talk about that now then. So, this term causal... So it's a bit of an incendiary word in some sort of context. And I'm sure when you're doing your investigations, there'll be arguments about, well, is it a direct cause? Is it an indirect cause? Is it a causal factor? Is it a contributory factor? Is it context? And what I'm here to say is it almost doesn't really matter what we label it. What we have to do is be mindful of how that label affects our thoughts about causality. And so I prefer to, when we start arguing about is it a causal factor or not, if we haven't done an STPA analysis or a CAST analysis, we really should just refer to it with a less incendiary term such as contributory or candidate, perhaps. Because at this stage of the investigation, it's not really helpful putting these kind of incendiary labels on things. So let's just give it a neutral label and then come back to it later on. Let's look at the context of it later on, the contribution of it, should I say. And of course, having issues with similar call signs, that can cause delays and extra workload in the various feedback loops across the control structure. And so there's definitely a contribution, but whether you want to go and label it as a causal factor, I think is a bit of an academic conversation. No disrespect to the way other investigators do this and the language that they use, but I don't really think it's sort of helpful having an argument about whether it's got this particular label or this particular label. Really, it's trying to understand, well, how did it influence the behavior of a controller, and how did it propagate across the control structure so that there were issues across that control structure, to do with coordination, timing, collaboration, things like that. Anyway, so at 062750, the approach control, approach control transmitted a set of instructions. So you could say transmitted a set of instructions is a control action of some description. Apparently directed, I'm presuming that's directed to GA152, and that says apparently directed, but using the call sign MERPATI152. You turn left, heading 240, vectoring for ILS runway 05 from the right side. Traffic now about rolling. Okay, so let's just let's have a look. Let's put that in there then. Instruction aimed, apparently directed to GA152 with incorrect call. In fact, I'm not going to say incorrect. With call sign MERPATI152. Okay. Okay. And of course, if I just let's just, oh dear, don't want to go that far. There we go. We highlighted last time the last Livestream 3. There is mention of this other aircraft, BO683. I'm not sure that is MERPATI152. There we go. Let me just get my highlighter pen. Highlighter. There we go. Burak BO683 and GA152. Oh, so that was the departing aircraft. So that's the departing aircraft there. And so in this context, I'm just going to steal this one. So this was, hang on, duplicate. Let's put it on both screens. Zoom over here. Oh, there we go. That's because I was muted. Oh my gosh. Have I been talking away for all that time while I'm muted? Thanks, Manuel. Okay, yeah, what I was saying is, I was just saying that there were a number of aircraft flying around with various call signs which were similar. So there was Mapati 152, which was an earlier flight. Thanks for that, Manuel. Then there was Mapati 153 and then Indonesia 153. And they were both within 30 minutes prior to the accident in the same ATS route. So yeah, similar call sign operation was certainly something that is a concern, shall we say. Okay, and at 06:27, 50 seconds, the approach control transmitted a set of instructions apparently directed to GA152. So I'll just make this bigger so you can see it. This was not recognised by the GA152 flight crew, as you would expect, because they're not listening for GA152. Well, I say not listening. Of course they're listening, but they're not necessarily tuned to it. If they don't shout your name across the room, you're not going to pick up and listen to it, are you? So you could argue that there is a potential contributory control action from this median approach controller. But there isn't enough information at this stage to really say, yes, that definitely is a contributory control action. But it's certainly a candidate that we would want to look at and think about. So again, why would it make sense for the median approach controller to refer to Mapati 152 instead of GA152? There's already the concept that they both got the same number, 152, and I'm sure all the human factors experts that watch these videos, they will be able to talk about this in a lot more detail than I possibly can. But there are some human factors aspects here that would conspire against the controller to talk about the wrong aircraft and provide instructions to the wrong aircraft. Now, it'd be interesting to know, as we go through the rest of the investigation report, it'd be interesting to know what disruption that radio call actually had on Mapati 152. Did they have to, later recover Mapati 152? Was there a potential near miss or other safety incident related to Mapati 152? That would be interesting to know. So this was not recognised by GA152 flight crew. So if you think about the control actions and the timing perspective, when the controller provides the control action, they themselves may not have recognised that they've provided an incorrect control action. Of course, that's my understanding right now on page 37. On page 38, it might say, yes, the median approach controller recognised that they misspoke or whatever the issue was, and then they provided a correct control action, a corrective control action. But again, it's in the minds of GA152 flight crew. They've not recognised it because it's not, from their perspective, addressed to them. So let's keep going. So the repeated instruction. So there was a repeated instruction, so they repeated it. Fantastic. So they did it twice. Did not specify from which side of the runway 05 ILS should be captured. Okay, turn left, heading 235 now, vectoring for ILS runway 05. So there was no sort of direction information in that control action. Okay, so let's just, so this was the first one. So let's put candidate contributory control action. Hang on a minute. I need to put my caps lock on. There we go. Candidate. Let's zoom in so you can see. Candidate contributory control action 01. Median approach controller provided, so what was the instruction? Turn left, vectoring, okay, provided direction instruction, or is it vector instruction? Vector instruction with call sign 152, apparently directed to GA152. Right, so before I continue and before we get loads of angry people in the comments, obviously this is just the starting point of the analysis. Getting ready to do the analysis, capturing information, making sense of the information, and then trying to put it in a form that we can use for an analysis. And this here is I've labelled it as a contributory control action, but it's a candidate. So I don't know yet, based on the understanding I have, whether this is a genuine contributory control action, or whether it's just something that sounds like it might be, but as we go through the rest of the report and learn more information, actually it's just a standard control action that somebody misspoke. It's not a big deal. We don't need to look at it in any detail, but I'm capturing it now because it makes sense to do that. And I'm also going to put a squiggly line there just to emphasize that this is a work in progress. It's preliminary. As we learn more, as I learn more, as I look at the rest of the report, things are going to start to make more sense, and so I'll probably come back and update this. And I've also tried to specify it in a formalized specification like you would as part of an STPA hazard analysis, because it's good practice to do that. It sort of gets your creative thinking going, your creative juices. So there we go. There's the controller, the source controller that provides the control action. The vector instruction with call sign 152, that is the control action that they're providing. And I've included there some context apparently directed to GA152. Now, if I was to turn that into a more formalized STPA control action, of course I wouldn't mention specific, flight call signs and things like that. I'd make it more specific to the action of providing air traffic control instructions. So I hope that sort of gives you a little bit of food for thought. It is a work in progress. We are going to evolve it later on. And then they said there was a second repeated control action, so I'm just going to chuck that in there as well. Candidate control action 02. Let's have a look. Repeated. Where is it? Repeated instruction to GA152, omitting which side of the runway 05 ILS should be captured. There we go. So you could argue that that one is a distinct... Well, I suppose... Well, the first one has got an issue with the wrong aircraft that they're trying to communicate with and coordinate with. And then the second one is about not including some key piece of information. Yeah, okay. Now we're going to need to do some work on that, but there we go. It is possible that with standard ILS approach procedure preset, so let's just make a note of that, standard ILS approach procedure, and that was preset in the pilot in command's mind. This omission fostered his expectation of the approach path that was different from the approach controller's intended path. So let's just let's have a look. Let's just add some details. So we've got a standard ILS approach procedure. And again, like I mentioned last time, these boxes here, these two yellow boxes with a black border, these are not candidate controllers in the formal sense, because a controller by definition is an entity, an agent that has the ability to make decisions and provide control actions, make a change in the world, if you like. Now, a procedure or a manual or a piece of paper, they're just bits of paper, they're not controllers in the formal sense, because they can't make decisions and they can't provide control actions. Only in combination with a controller, a human being, or maybe software, hardware, can they actually provide some control actions. Now, of course, a procedure or a manual will include information to update the beliefs of a controller, the mental model of a human, and also it'll influence their decision making, their control algorithm. So, of course, the content of a procedure will be control algorithms, decision makings, and information to update the mental model and beliefs. But without a human, without an agent, without some software and some hardware, they're not formal controllers. So just be mindful of that when you're building your control structure models. It might help for me just to change the color of the border, just to sort of emphasize these are not controllers, they are documents for all intents and purposes. But I'm not going to. I'm going to keep you guessing just to help make you think when you're building your models. I need to be discreet about whether it's a controller or whether I'm adding extra detail to the model for the purposes of a narration summary, and not to confuse them with controllers. So emission fostered. So the standard ILS approach procedure. So that will influence. Let's have a look. In fact, what I'll do is I'll steal these from over there. In fact, no. What I'll do is I will copy it and then put it over there. Right. Let's just duplicate that, stick it over here. Let's move this bit down here. So we've already got the median approach controller. Let's stick them down there and bring them to the front. And let's put this one and this one out the way, just over to the side for the time being, just to keep them out of the way. Right, so, and we've got the standard ILS approach. Let's put these down there as well. So we've got the A300 flight crew manual, and that's for Garuda, so let's put that over there. We've got the standard ILS approach procedure, so let's put an arrow from there to the median approach controller, an arrow there to the crew of GA152, and then let's put another one of those arrows from the Garuda A300 flight manual to the crew of that aircraft. So I'm just going to put those out the way. In fact, I probably shouldn't be so cruel to confuse everybody, so I'll make them orange. There we go. We know that they're not controllers in the formal sense, they're just documents. I'm including them at this stage of the model just to remind myself that these things exist and that they will have some level of influence over the behaviour and decision making of the median approach controller and the Garuda 152 crew. Now, of course, in theory, the standard ILS approach procedure for runway 05, they should influence the beliefs and decision making, the control algorithm and mental models of those two controllers, and in theory they should be coordinated. They should have the same understanding about what that approach procedure is. Now, as it said in the document we've just been looking at there, it said that the pilot in command had a certain preconceived idea of what the approach should be, and the median approach controller was not specific about what that approach should be. And so there's a question there over, they should have been specific about what the approach vector was and which way that they should capture the ILS. But because they didn't do that, that then leaves open the potential for them not to be coordinated. And that's sort of the initiation point of this particular sequence of events. So let's go back up here then. So we've got this emission fostered his expectation of the approach path that was different with the approach controller's intended path. So just to sort of, get that really embedded in your mind, you've got the pilots and their mental models and their belief about how things should be, progressing. And then you've got the beliefs of the air traffic controller and how they think the conduct of the flight should progress. Now, of course, they've not coordinated and agreed between the two of them what that should be. Now, of course, with expert pilots that have done this many, many times, they themselves might not detect that they've not received that important critical piece of information. It's just a standard human thing. That's how we work. And so, of course, when we're thinking about making recommendations for this, one of the recommendations is about how the air traffic controller provides information and makes sure that they have a common understanding with the flight crew what that instruction is and which direction they're going to take and how they're going to vector to the runway 05 ILS. Okay, so let's talk about non-standard phraseology. So this non-standard phraseology is this is a common theme that occurs in many aircraft accidents. One of the most ridiculous ones is the Tenerife disaster from 1977, which I think to this day is still classed as the world's worst air disaster purely because of the number of people that were lost in a particular event. And when you look at the control structure for that accident, and I did a presentation at MIT on it, 10 years this year, I think it is, not long, 9 years, 9 and a bit years. It's essentially the control structure hasn't really changed since then. And non-standard phraseology was one of the contributors to that accident, and ICAO took some actions to try and deal with that by having I think it's document 4444, which attempts to set standard radio phraseology. There it is, it's listed down there, look, there we go. Doc 4444. So that really is intended to mitigate this problem, but of course it's not easy to sort that kind of thing out. It requires people to be highly skilled, highly trained, and disciplined in the approach to the way that they communicate. And if they, for whatever reason, are not operating at that high standard, things like this can unfortunately happen. Now, I'm not pointing fingers and blaming people. I'm just saying we have thinking about things through the lens of having a controller providing control actions. Those control actions have to be systematic. And so, how do we go about training people and developing their skills and attitude and discipline to be able to perform to that high level standard? And is it really appropriate to rely upon people to do that? There's an open sort of, maybe a rhetorical question to have a think about there, but let's move on. So the CVR recording also revealed that the use of standard radio telephony procedures in ATC pilot comms was not duly observed and obeyed. Based on the recorded transcript, several portions of the phraseology were not properly used. Based on the interviews and written statements signed by the controller on duty at the time of the occurrence, he reported to have observed, on his secondary surveillance radar screen that flight GA152 did not maintain 2,000 feet but was descending below the assigned altitude to 1,800 feet and even to 1,600 feet until the last radar return disappeared from his radar screen. Okay. So in my mind there's two distinct topics there. One is providing instructions using standard phraseology, and one is about the control of the aircraft and it going below 2,000 feet. For me, they're two distinct topics. I'm not sure why that's mentioned there, but anyway, even though the controller may not have been sure about the reliability of the radar readout, okay. So from a mental model perspective, the controller is saying they weren't sure about the reliability of the radar readout, so I suppose there's potential that it could be misreading height, maybe, I don't know. It was apparent that there was neither a warning nor question from the controller to the pilot to check the altitude and position or to take immediate action, such as report altitude when the level changed or climb immediately. So when we're talking about contributory control actions, we can talk about, these control actions were not provided. Of course, there's context there. They may not have provided them because they didn't believe that it was necessary, perhaps, or they didn't recognise it was necessary. And so, of course, we shouldn't be talking about those as unsafe control actions as we would if we were doing an STPA. We might talk about these as contributory control actions, such as not providing a report altitude or not providing a climb immediately at the time when he saw the level was below 2,000 feet. So of course, as part of the investigation, we'd want to work out, well, why was that? Why did they not provide those control actions? Why did it make sense to them in their context not to do that? So let's add those to our control action list there. So let's just, I'll add another one. There we go. Let's put it there. Stretch it out here, and we'll call it contributory control action 03. So Medan, in fact I need to zoom in so you can see better, don't I? Medan approach controller did not provide, let's have a look, what did we say it was called? Report altitude when the level changed. So I know what I can do. Let me put this at the top of the screen up there, and then I can put this one across the bottom of the screen there, and I'll stretch them out so it's a bit easier to see. There we go. That's better, isn't it? Fantastic. Right, so where's our controller gone? Don't tell me I've just broken it. Oh, there it is. There it is. Right. So Medan approach controller did not provide report altitude when GA152 level changed. There we go. And what was the other one? Copy, paste, change that to 04. Medan approach controller did not provide climb immediately when GA level was below 2,000 feet. Now you'll notice for that second one, and this might sound a bit academic, and please bear with me a minute, because what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to capture the control actions independent of any kind of judgment about either the controller or the control action itself. I'm just trying to get the bare bones of what it is, what the structure is. So we've got the controller, Medan approach controller, and then we've got the control action type did not provide, the control action itself, climb immediately, and then the context, so when GA152 level was below 2,000 feet. Now, of course, if I was doing an air traffic control related STPA, I wouldn't refer to GA152 level, that specific aircraft. I'd just say, generic aircraft tail number, whatever it is, call sign. And then again, the limits, the feet, those feet are specific for this airfield in that particular location. If you were looking at another airport, they'd have perhaps different criteria. So of course, when you're doing that kind of analysis with STPA, you'd want to be, not ambiguous, but you want to be specific enough that it makes sense for the particular context that you're analysing. Whereas because we're doing a cast accident analysis, we're looking at this specific instance, and so what is the specific context for this instance? So there we go. Medan approach control did not provide climb immediately when GA152 level was below 2,000 feet. Now I'm assuming from the documentation that they are supposed to do that. There is some kind of procedure, some kind of training that's what the air traffic controller should do. That's why they're mentioning it. And for whatever reason unexplained so far, that didn't happen. So we need to capture those as contributory control actions. And as part of the analysis later on, we need to explore, well, why was that? Why did it make sense for the controller not to do that? Because there may be some really, genuine, reasons why they didn't do that. The point of the investigation is not to try and point fingers and assign blame, they should have done it, they didn't do it, it's their fault. Our job as investigators is to try and understand, well, what was it about this particular controller and their control actions, and then of course about the control structure and the context within which they find themselves. How does that contribute? Okay, so I've talked about that a lot, so let's keep moving. In fact, let me just highlight those so I don't forget them. So you've got that one and that one and that one. There we go. However, the existing procedures for surveillance approach, radar vectoring, did not require controllers to respond as such, and they were not trained to do so. Okay, right. I'm a bit sort of surprised by that. That's a bit strange. Okay, let's just ICAO doc 4444 rules of the air and air traffic services. Right, so they're saying the existing procedures is this ICAO document, but that document does not require controllers to respond as such, and they were not trained to do so. Okay. So existing procedures did not require controllers to respond, and they were not trained to do so. So that explains why they didn't do that. But the next question, I'm hoping you're sort of already foreshadowing, is, well, why were they not required to do that? I mean, it seems kind of logical, doesn't it? You know, why were they not required to do that? Is that not part of standard training for the air traffic controllers? If it's not part of standard training for the air traffic controllers, then there's a very big set of questions here for the way air traffic control is managed and trained and assured in this organisation. So who or what is responsible for that? And you'll notice, there we go, so I've highlighted over here the other control structures. So there's the air traffic control operations and the airport authority. So there's now some big questions there over, well, you know, if they're not providing these control actions because they're not trained to do that, why is that? Why does the control structure not train them to do that? I wouldn't like to just say, well, it's all down to ICAO document 4444, because I understand that provides standard phraseology, not necessarily for this particular circumstance. Or maybe it does, but they're just not trained in it. Okay, interesting. When the controller requested confirmation if the aircraft was turning left, and the reply was, we are turning right now. Okay, so let's just go down here. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to separate this out, put it over here, because it's getting a bit busy, that one. Let's just put it over there. So let's have a look. So control action number 5. Medan approach controller requested confirmation that GA152 was turning left. The feedback that they received from the aircraft was feedback GA152 turning right now. The approach controller's perception was that the aircraft was turning left. So when we say perception, we're thinking about the mental model of that controller, that person. The approach control's mental model was that the aircraft was turning left and instructed accordingly. Okay, continue left now, which can be construed as an apparent communication breakdown between ATC and flight crew. Well, it's not just communication breakdown, it is sharing a common mental model and understanding of, what is the state of the system, the control process, the position and direction of the aircraft. And then again, what is the instruction? You know, is it to turn left? Is it to turn right? Is it to GA152 or the other aircraft that was mentioned? So yeah, so let's just stick this over here. Sugar. So they were communicating with GA152. GA152 is turning right now. Now, did the median approach controller hear that and recognise that they said they're turning right now instead of turning left as they were instructed? And was the median approach controller, you know, providing and reinforcing the control action they provided? No, you need to turn left. Or did they mishear it and just repeat the instruction anyway? I mean, I suppose if they repeat the instruction, that implies that they recognise that it was the response they received was not what they were expecting. Excuse me for a moment, I'll have a quick drink. Must remember to unmute myself. There we go. Fantastic. Okay, so continue turn left now. There we go. Can't spell continue. I could stretch this down a bit so it's out of the way. There we go, there's a bit more space there. Fantastic, right, so which can be construed as apparent communication breakdown between ATC and the flight crew, yes. But again, is communication breakdown as a concept, is that a really helpful label? Because as you're looking at this through the lens of STAMP and thinking about control algorithms and mental models and coordination between controllers, you can start to see, well, it's not just communication breakdown, there's more to it than that. So when the aircraft reply was, we are starting turning right now, the approach controller exclaimed, "Adur," an Indonesian exclamation reflecting to unexpected shock or surprise. Excuse me. So is that another bit of feedback? So feedback. GA152. We are starting turning right now. So did that come afterwards? Okay, continue left now. So that's a confirmation they're going the other way. Is that an indication that the crew of GA152 misheard and misunderstood the instruction? Or is it that they interpreted the instruction because, you know, for various contexts, which we should get to later on? So they had an unexpected shock or surprise. Based on the interview, the controller was suddenly aware that a dangerous situation was developing or has developed as the aircraft is flying outside of the localizer footprint. Okay. The next communication with the aircraft was not an immediate warning of the situation, but it was an instruction to continue turn right, heading 050. So let's just move that down a bit. Let's put those up there a little bit. So this is a control action. Continue turn right, heading 015. Okay. It is required that ATC controllers be immediately aware of the potential or existing emergency situations and take immediate and appropriate actions by using exact and correct phraseology without creating uncertainty. So when it says it's required, where is that required? Because we've already sort of highlighted there was a bit of ambiguity about what's in Doc 4444 and the training that the approach controller has been provided. Okay, and when we're talking about awareness, again, it's down to their mental model. Are they aware? Did they appreciate and recognise the criticality of the situation? The investigation was unable to view... Oh, interesting. Unable to view any documentation relating to guidance for controllers of what phrases to use and in what circumstances. Interesting. So between Doc 4444 and the approach controller, they weren't able to establish what was going on with that particular control path, for want of a better description. Interesting. Most phraseology is taught while obtaining a rating, and the airways operations instructions are not commonly available for reference. Okay. Taught while obtaining a rating. Okay, so there's a process of some description. Obtain air traffic controller rating. Again, I'm highlighting it there as a controller. It is a candidate controller. We'd need to understand a bit more about it as we go through this process. You know, of course, I'm assuming that later on in this investigation report, it's going to talk about the process for the controller getting a rating and how they're tested, the things that they're taught and all that kind of good stuff. So I'm just going to put that there. There are some things called airways operating instructions. Fantastic. Okay, so let's airways operations instructions. We don't really know much about that, but if they are important and they're not commonly available for reference, why is that? Who controls them? You know, that's always the question when we're doing a stamp-based analysis. What is the activity or process, control process we're thinking about? And then who or what controls that process? You know, is it an individual? Is it an organisation? Is it a group? You know, who's in control of it? Because if it's not in control, or it's not clear who's in control, then that is a contributor for inadequate control that will lead to an accident or a loss. So that is what we're looking for. We're not looking specifically for failures or what went wrong. We're looking for what I call dangerous successes. So this is where the system behaved as designed, and that has contributed to a loss. So, you know, what went right in that context that led to the loss? And it sounds like we're sort of touching up against that. Okay, 273. Controller's workload. With limited personnel available, there we go, that's an interesting bit of context. The common practice was that the watch supervisor, watch supervisor of ADC and APP and ACC operations was also scheduled to serve and carry out tasks at the controlling position. Oh dear, here we go, right. So we've got a watch supervisor, and they are the supervisor of ADC, APP and ACC operations, and they were also scheduled to serve and carry out tasks at the controlling position. Now, if I remember rightly, we had a chat about this last time on a different control structure. Let's just have a look. Oh, so that's the airline, it's not that one. There we go, yeah, Medan Air Traffic Control, Medan Airport Air Traffic Control. So very broadly, we've got the Polonia Airport, Medan, we've got the Air Traffic Services Division, we've got the Air Traffic Controls Area Control Service, and we've got the Approach Control Service, we've got the Aerodrome Control Service, and then under that we've got the actual control areas. So we've got East and West, the Terminal Manoeuvring Area, Terminal Control Area, the Control Zone, and then the Medan Aerodrome Traffic Zone. So when this was talking about, let's have a look. where is it? Down here. This was talking about ADC. So where's ADC? It's not mentioned. APP, it's not mentioned. ACC is not mentioned. So so which is it? What was this person doing? If not this description here, what were they doing? Let's have a look at the glossary. The glossary is always a good place to start. There we go. ACC is Area Control Center. So let's put that in there. Area, can't spell, Control Center. And it's an American spelling, so we're going to do that. ACC. I'm going to give that a light colour. There we go. Area Control Center. And the ADC is Aerodrome. Oh, it is Aerodrome Controller. So that's the controller themselves. Aerodrome Controller. So that's ADC. So I'll put that over there. And then we've got APP, which is APP, there it is, approach control. Ah, right, okay, so it is approach controller APP. Okay, so let's just take these, put them down here. So approach controller is that one, I think, approach control service, if you can see that. Aerodrome controller, I think, is Aerodrome Control Service, so we'll stick it there. And Area Control Center, I think it's probably Medan Control Areas there, look. Across those two. So this one person was doing those three things all at the same time. Right, okay. Interesting. Is that right? Common practice was the watch supervisor of those was also scheduled to serve and carry out tasks at the controlling position. This arrangement was made in order that the total 37 controllers can maintain the operations. This figure was actually, yeah, I was about to say that. I'm sure it's below the actual minimum. Yeah, there it is. Far below the minimum requirement of 60. So 37 versus 60. As calculated by the Chief ATS Division, whoever that is. I don't know who that is. The multitask assignment had presumably increased the controller's workload, which could have reduced his performance. Okay. Because this is the thing, it's saying this as presumably it's increased the controller's workload, which could have reduced its performance. On the day, maybe it was a light workload, so it's not a big deal. You know, if you've got many plates and you can interact with them and you're not disturbed, of course you can spin many plates. But you're in a potentially fragile situation. All you need is a small number of disturbances and all of a sudden you're not able to manage your workload and things start to get dropped. And then potentially something really important gets dropped. So from a control structure perspective, we've already identified a hotspot in the control structure. You know, the control structure was not resourced adequately to be able to provide that level of service. But again, when I say adequately, it's in the context of what the anticipated workload is and whether or not they probably didn't realise how fragile things were. And interestingly enough, this is the similar sort of situation to the Uberlink disaster, where there was an air traffic controller looking after two sectors of the sky, and they didn't have the available collision alert, conflict alerting available to them. So they were merrily dealing with two different desks, and aircraft were converging on each other, and unfortunately a lot of people lost their lives. And again, they were put in a situation, the air traffic controller was put in a situation, air traffic control management permitted that kind of operation for many, many years. And it was only, unfortunately, on this occasion, with the controller workload and the distraction and the non-availability of alerts, that accident occurred. And this is a similar sort of thing. This is about how the ATC operations are controlled and resourced. Of course, that's not down to the individual air traffic controller, unless, of course, they've got multiple jobs, multiple hats. So the multitask assignment had presumably increased the controller's workload, which could have reduced his performance. As I said, I don't think it's just about workload, it's about increasing fragility. It is a fragile control structure in this respect. Okay, so that's all about air traffic control. I can't say I'm particularly impressed with that. That's basically 2 pages, 1.5 to 2 pages about the air traffic controller and what's going on, and that's it. There's not much there. Of course, we don't know the political circumstances that the investigation was, conducted under. One of the things I always say about stamp-based analysis, if we did a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats analysis, a SWOT analysis, one of the strengths of the stamp-based approach, CAST or STPA, is it finds things and it's very good at it. It can help facilitate you asking really, really powerful questions and, finding some very interesting things. But of course, one of the threats with that approach, because it is so good at that, if you apply it in a context such as this, you're going to find lots of stuff to do with management and leadership. And some organisations, unfortunately, can be allergic to that kind of, somebody putting a spotlight on it. So, of course, when you're using the stamp-based approaches, you've got to be mindful that you might be shining lights where people don't necessarily want the light, the spotlight shining. And so, of course, you've got to be mindful of that and how you might, be careful how you deal with it, be respectful and everything else. But make sure you do shine the spotlight where you need to shine it. If that makes sense. So MED and air traffic, the air traffic controller, so they've talked about the controller, they've talked about the workloads. The next logical thing I would expect to see, if we were doing a stamp-based analysis, a CAST analysis, is, what about the air traffic controller management? Who allowed or permitted them to be only 37 of 60 controllers? Why were they still operating in that way? Why were they not putting other mitigations in place so that they could operate with that many controllers? Even if it's reducing the throughput of the airport, if that's what needs to be done, then that's what needs to be done. So that's what the investigation should go and look at. Why did it make sense for the management of air traffic control to put an air traffic controller in a position that wasn't using standard radio phraseology in conditions when the airport was below minimums as well? I mean, that's another avenue of inquiry. In fact, let's just have a look. So the next section, 2.8, is about flight automation. 2.9 is about GPWS. 2.10 is about conversion training. So where's the bit about ATC management and about the decisions not to close the airport or restrict traffic? Did the investigation not look at that? I mean, if they didn't, that looks like quite a big hole, but we'll see later on why that made sense not to. I would like to hope later on in the investigation report there'll be a section that explains why they didn't look at the management of air traffic control at this airport. I hoping that's what they've done. Anyway, let's keep going. In fact, actually, while we're doing that, are there any questions? The audience, the people watching, the 2 people that are watching. What questions do you have? Does this make sense? Do you disagree with what I'm saying? Do you think I'm talking nonsense? Please comment in the chat. Let me know your thoughts. Fantastic. Okay, well, nobody said anything, so everyone must be having a great time. Let's keep moving. So, flight automation. Let's make this full screen so you can see it okay. Flight automation, longitudinal modes. The flight data recorder data plot of the aircraft altitude during descent, as shown at figure 26, indicates several facts. Namely, the aircraft captured altitude of 3,000 feet as instructed. Okay, fantastic. The aircraft had a constant descent rate of 900 feet per minute from 3,000 feet down to 1550, which is the approximate altitude of initial impact with a treetop. Okay, so that's interesting. If we're thinking about a control loop and we're thinking about the aircraft trajectory being under the control of the aircraft, perhaps the autopilot, and then of course the crew, so they control the aircraft and they also control and program the autopilot. If there's a constant descent rate below the altitude of 3,000 feet that they're being cleared to, that might suggest, issues with the crew or the flight, the automation or the aircraft itself. Now, there's no mention earlier on in the report about that potential, so there might be something else going on that we might want to consider. And of course, it might come out in this section. The aircraft did not capture 2,000 feet altitude as instructed. Okay, that's interesting. Excuse me, so they did do 3,000 feet. So that suggests then, if they've got to 3,000 feet and then there is a constant descent rate of about 900 feet, then that sounds like that was a conscious control action, a conscious action on the part of the flight crew. But of course, once it got below approached 2,000 feet and got below it, that's when it's now out of control potentially, or inadequately controlled, I should say. So Michael says, makes perfect sense. Thanks, Michael. I feel so much better now, and I really appreciate that. Thank you. There are 6 modes in the flight automation for changing the aircraft altitude. The plot shows a relatively constant rate of descent, indicating that the vertical speed mode was selected by the flight crew. There are 3 possible explanations of why the aircraft did not capture the 2,000 feet altitude as instructed by approach control. The pilot used the vertical speed mode as usually used during approach, while the window altitude was set at a number higher than 3,000 feet. Okay. Here the pilot used the thumb wheel and inserted the desired descent rate, for instance 900 feet per minute. He then activated the vertical speed mode button. In this combination, the aircraft would then descend continuously and the automatic flight system would not capture any altitude. Okay, so if we're thinking about the control, the auto flight control, if you like, automatic flight system, that particular mode, that particular control algorithm, if you like, is about the descent rate. It's not smart enough to, deal with the altitude unless it's programmed to do that, which is what this is describing. The pilot used the vertical speed node while the window altitude was set at a lower altitude than 2,000 feet. Okay. Here the pilot used a thumb wheel to insert the desired descent rate, and then followed by the activation of the vertical speed mode button. The aircraft would then descend continuously to selected altitude, which was lower than 2,000 feet. Okay, so that's another explanation. And then finally, failure of the autopilot system to capture the selected altitude. Okay. So notice the word failure there, everybody. So yes, there could have been a genuine failure with the autopilot system, absolutely. But that's not just what we're looking at as part of a stamp-based investigation. We're also looking at reasons, why it behaved the way it did, which was not due to a failure. It was due to what I call a dangerous success. So the thing has behaved as it's designed. The fact that it's designed to result in a bad outcome is an issue we'd need to look at as part of the investigation. So at time frame 1131, the flight crews initiate a rigorous climb maneuver. So this is a control action to climb. Such action disengaged the autopilot as recorded on the FDR at 1133. However, the CVR did not record the oral warning for disengagement of the autopilot, as should be expected. So that's interesting, because that is interesting. So let's just let's get our let's have a look. Let's use that one. No, how are we going to do this? So we've got the aircraft, we've got the flight control system. Let's steal that and put it over here. Let's get rid of that bit. Where are we? We're over here, aren't we? Let's just do it there. GPWS. So that. Move it there like this. So we've got GA152 aircraft. In fact, actually, what I'll do is I'll do it like this. So we've got the A300 B4, I think, isn't it? Something like that. There we go. And that aircraft there is a, what do they call it? Flight, where is it? Flight automation is one way to describe it. So we've got flight automation there. We've got vertical speed mode is a type of mode. And then we've got, I'm sure there was some other way to describe it. What was it called? Flight automation. There we go. That's one way to describe it. There's the FDR. I'm sure there was another way they described it. I think I'm going crazy. Autopilot system. Okay, so let's make the model a bit different then. So we've got the A300 B4 is the aircraft and its flight path. We've got the, what do they call it? The autopilot system. You could say that we've got a flight control system in there as well. There we go. Flight control system. We've got an autopilot system. And then we've got the aircraft itself. So let's do that. Nope, don't want to do that, Simon. Flight control system, like that. And then we've got an autopilot system that also interacts with the aircraft, like that. In fact, no, it's probably like that, isn't it? And then the crew, pilot in command, they interact with the flight control system as well. And the aircraft provides feedback to them. The autopilot system will provide some kind of feedback to them. I might call these the flight crew just to make this a bit of a simpler model for the sake of simplicity. There we go. Right, so we've got autopilot system, flight control system, some feedback from the aircraft. So let's make that a bit bigger. Make that bigger. Put the flight control system there. Put the autopilot system there. Make the flight crew wider. There we go. Right, what I'm just doing now is I'm trying to draw a quick model just to sort of illustrate some points. I don't want to make things too complicated. So the aircraft provides feedback to the flight crew. The flight crew provides some other types of control actions, not in relation to controlling the trajectory of the aircraft. So this could represent, thrust control, flaps, things like that. Whereas this autopilot system in this context is about vertical speed or altitude. And then the flight control system, again, that's about changing the direction of the aircraft and its trajectory of its flight. So yeah, I hope that sort of, let me just make that a bit more compact so you can see more of it on the screen at once. There we go. So we've got the flight path at the bottom. That is the control process, the physical process. The aircraft itself, I've abstracted that in as a block to represent, all the flying control surfaces and the engines and all of that good stuff. I don't want to add detail about that. Then there's the flight control system. So that is the system that's directly involved in this case, moving the vertical stabilizers. Sorry, moving the aircraft up and down vertically. There's the autopilot system. I've said that the autopilot system provides some kind of feedback to the flight crew. Of course, the flight crew are providing some kind of control actions into the autopilot to tell it what speed mode it needs to be in. So that, where is it? Flight automation. So I'll just put flight automation autopilot. There we go, that's right. Right, so the crew, let's have a look. Yeah, so this is control altitude. And I can't spell, there we go, altitude, control altitude. The autopilot controls altitude as well. In fact, let me just move these to the right a bit. There we go, so you can see that. So the pilots control the altitude using the actual control yoke, but they also control altitude using the flight automation, so the autopilot system. There we go. And then of course the flight autopilot system, that controls altitude. Now what this said over here is there's three scenarios. So the first one is about the flight automation mode. So the mode is a type of control algorithm. So what I'm going to do is just going to make this little box control algo or decision making. Make this a smaller box. There we go. Make the writing even smaller. Oh, I can't make the writing even smaller than that. Oh, of course. Typical. Dear. There we go, that'll do, won't it? So this logically has a control algorithm, some kind of decision making that, the autopilot system makes decisions based on information, based on instructions from the flight crew, based on feedback perhaps from the aircraft. So let's maybe get some altitude information perhaps back to the flight control system. And so it'll control the altitude based on that algorithm. And it says over here there are three modes for that algorithm. So the first one is vertical speed mode, but it is about whether it's captured the 2,000 feet as altitude. Sorry, it's about the window altitude was set at a number higher than 3,000 feet. So this is the window altitude is a process model. So I'm going to add that on here as well. There we go. So process model. PM, process model, or beliefs, if we want to use some more standard normal human language. So if the process model is, you need to control the speed based on that 3,000 feet. Let's just get my pen. So vertical speed mode, as usual, usually used during approach, while the window altitude was set at a number higher than 3,000 feet. So the pilot has told the pilot has provided a control action, this control action to the autopilot that says you need to use vertical speed mode, and the window altitude was set at a number higher than 3,000 feet. So it's higher than what the aircraft currently is. So this feedback could be aircraft altitude, the belief is that it's below the altitude that's been selected, and so what does the algorithm of that autopilot system do? Does it disregard it? Does it put itself, does it provide potential unsafe control actions based on that? That is a possibility. I'm not suggesting we need to drill into the design of the flight control system, the autopilot system today. I'm just saying that these are the kind of questions that you might want to ask as part of your investigation when you're looking at it through the lens of STAMP and through the concept of a control loop. Yeah, the aircraft did not capture the 2,000 feet altitude as instructed. Maybe there was a feedback delay in the altitude system or some other issues in that control loop that explains why that is a possibility or not. The next one, the pilot used the vertical speed node while the altitude was set at a lower altitude than 2,000 feet. So again, there's demanded altitude and actual altitude, and then the potential for it not to be what you expect. The aircraft would then descend continuously to selected altitude, which was lower than 2,000 feet. So again, the autopilot is providing an unsafe control action because that setting is incorrect. Interesting. Failure of the autopilot system to catch the altitude, selected altitude. So they initiate a rigorous climb maneuver. So let's look at this. So this is a rigorous, I can't spell, rigorous climb maneuver. That's not right, is it? Hang on a minute. Is that Americanism? Is that an American spelling? Come on. Rigorous. Okay, all right. I'll let you have this one. So rigorous climb maneuver, and it says, where is it? Rigorous climb maneuver, there we go. So they provide that. Such action disengage the autopilot. So there's a implied disengagement of the autopilot. I don't know if that's directly from the flight crew or whether it's a function of the flight control system that will tell the autopilot you need to disengage. So disengage the autopilot. However, the CVR did not record the oral warning for disengagement of the autopilot as should be expected. So that would be this feedback here. Why was this feedback not provided? So this is the, what do they call it? The oral warning. Autopilot disengaged engagement oral warning. So why was that not? In fact, let's just make all these arrows size 10. Because otherwise it's... size 10. Size 10. Size 10. There we go. Autopilot disengagement. Oral warning not provided. Provided. Okay, so was that autopilot disengagement oral warning from the autopilot system directly, or actually is it actually supposed to come from the aircraft itself via the aircraft human machine interface? And the reason I'm asking that is because depending on the architecture of the system, if it's supposed to give an autopilot disengagement oral warning, why did the autopilot system not do that? So what is the control algorithm, the decision making for providing that oral warning, and why did it make sense not for it to be provided? Or is it that the flight automation autopilot system did require a warning, but it was not provided by the aircraft to the crew? So it's an issue with the warnings and alerts system, not the autopilot itself. So there's an avenue of inquiry to consider. And so, as should be expected, it is possible that there could be a problem with the flight automation system. Okay. I mean, I'm hoping that from the basic stuff we've just done now, you might be able to see how this could be a springboard for jumping into the exploration of potential issues with the flight control system, the flight automation. A check of the maintenance records in the period October 96 to September 97 revealed 167 problem reports related to the flight automation system, including autopilot system, flight director, auto thrust, pitch, TCC and FCC computers. Okay, so that's interesting. However, according to the aircraft manufacturer, the probability of failure of the autopilot leading to the non-capture of selected altitude is a very, very precise, specific number, 4.67 times 10 to the minus 10. Wow, that's that is an impressive number, I must say. I don't know if my sarcasm is coming across. And that such a failure had never been encountered on an Airbus fleet in more than 30 millions of flight hours. Yeah, sorry, mate. That's not giving me. It's not giving me confidence, because this could be due to a design error, not a failure. Yeah. I think we need to look at that a bit more. Therefore, the most probable cause for the autopilot did not capture 2,000 feet altitude is incorrect altitude setting. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about most probable cause. One of the things to think about when we're doing a stamp-based analysis is that we're not here to do probabilistic analyses. We don't care about this 10 to the minus 9, 10 to the minus 9 nonsense. When we're talking about complex systems, probability it doesn't help us anymore. It's an unhelpful, expensive distraction from what really matters. And again, it focuses on probabilities of failures. There could be very genuine reasons why this was due to the way the system is designed. It behaved as it's designed, and that is dangerous and not because of a failure. And again, we're talking about most probable cause here. I know that we've got a proverbial smoking hole in the ground. We can't get the evidence and get certainty around what the causes are, but that shouldn't stop us from then exploring some of these ideas. And I would like to say, and I don't know if I'm the first person to say this, but I'd like to say that when we're doing aircraft investigations today, and if we're using STAMP, STPA and CAST, all of these probabilities and failure numbers should be, thank you very much, let's just put them on one side and let's do a systematic analysis using the control loop. Because those numbers are just, they're just distractions. For me personally, they're just distractions. Anyway, I'll get off my high horse. So, so 2,000 feet is an incorrect altitude setting. An autopilot capture malfunction is possible but not probable. Great, but you've not looked at the design to confirm whether that is, what's happened in this case. You've just assumed that those numbers are correct and that the analysis they've done is correct. And I wouldn't be so convinced, actually, with what I know with STPA and the experiences I've had looking at various different systems across various different domains. I wouldn't be confident with that. And especially with the recent incidents, there's a few, I'm trying to think, there's a chap I'm connected with on LinkedIn. He's an Australian he's not an Australian, he's an ex-US Navy pilot who was flying an aircraft in Australia, an Airbus as well, that had uncommanded pitch down a few times. And, I'm not convinced. Anyway, the incorrect altitude setting might have been induced by the ease with which the altitude selector can inadvertently misset by 1,000 feet when releasing the knob. However, if there was adequate cross-checking between the pilots, an incorrect setting could have been rectified. There we go. So it's definitely not the automation, everybody, because it's 4.67. Remember the 0.67, because that's important, to the minus 10. So, this is never going to happen, not in I wouldn't say a million years, but not in a long time. And of course, even if it was an issue with the altitude selector knob, even if it was an issue with the hardware, there's supposed to be adequate cross-checking between the pilots. An incorrect setting could have been rectified. So, the pilot should have caught this if there was an issue with it. Interesting. Anyway, right. Let's look at the comments. So Michael says, still here in the first row, appreciating your humour. Thanks, Michael. Fantastic. Thank you for joining me. I've got 2 people watching now. Fantastic. Hello. Let us know where you're watching from. So we're nearly there. We've got 4 pages to go. Let's have a look. Lateral modes. Let's keep going, everybody. So this first one was about vertical modes. Sorry, longitudinal modes. And this one is now going to be about lateral modes. So let's have a look. There was an important difference in the operational function of the autopilot heading and heading select modes. Heading select could be used to turn the aircraft onto a new heading by altering the heading digits on the autopilot control panel. Pardon me, right. If the aircraft was wings level on a preset heading, turning the heading knob anti-clockwise resulted in a turn to the left, and turning it clockwise resulted in a turn to the right. These turns were no longer dependent on whether the heading index was to the left of the aircraft or to the right. The turn would continue in the same direction through up to 360 until the new heading was achieved. However, with the aircraft wings level, the heading mode could be selected by pressing the heading button below the heading change knob. The aircraft would then maintain the current heading whilst the new heading was pre-selected using the heading change knob. The change from heading mode to heading select mode was achieved by pulling the heading change knob. At the moment, the aircraft would roll into the turn required to achieve the pre-selected heading in the shortest direction. For instance, if on a heading of 225 magnetic, heading mode is selected and the heading pre-selected to 46 by rotating the heading change knob clockwise to the right, then the knob is pulled to change heading select mode. The aircraft will turn to the left. Okay. So it's about the magnetic heading, not the heading of the aircraft at the time. I'm not a pilot. Well, I used to fly gliders. I used to enjoy flying gliders, and I've done a bit of powered flying, but not anything like this. So I don't know, is this normal, the design to be based around the magnetic heading? So the algorithm in the heading autopilot heading mode is that if you select, well, in this case, if you're on heading 225 and then you pre-select 46, which is, almost 180 degrees behind you. It's not 180 degrees, is it? It's quite far. The heading change knob clockwise to the right. Then the knob is pulled to change the heading select mode. The aircraft will turn to the left. For me, that's a bit confusing, because if you turn to the right, you'd expect the aircraft to turn to the right, but in this case, it'll turn left. Interesting, right. I'm not, I can't say, as a layperson, it just sounds like a bit of a strange thing to do. Rotating the heading change knob close to the right, the knob is pulled, the aircraft will turn left. I don't know if that's relevant. Maybe with highly trained pilots, if they know that that's the algorithm of the automation, then that's fine. Anyway, the possibility of this occurring on GA152 at the point where the aircraft turned to the left instead of to the right, as instructed, has been considered. However, further analysis of ATC and CVR transcripts, as discussed in Chapter 2.5, revealed the flight crew was aware of the left turn. Okay. So if they were aware of the left turn, does that mean they were aware and not arguing about why is the automation doing something weird? Because obviously we've not seen the transcript, so I'm going to assume that the transcript, wasn't that they had an issue with the automation. I don't want to call into question the integrity of this investigation report and what's in it. That's not the purpose of this case study. It's to look at the details that's in there and have a think about it through the lens of stamp, STPA and CAST. Okay, so GPWS, right, so we talked about all of that stuff. Let's talk about GPWS then. So for those at the back that don't know what GPWS is, it is an acronym for Ground Proximity Warning System. So we've got an oral and visual warning. In fact, actually, let me preempt things and I'll add a GPWS, Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS. I'm going to add a controller there because I think it's going to be important to the control structure. So we've got a GPWS. I've stuck it in the control structure, so I'm going to give it a colour orange. The FDR data showed that the GPWS bit was on for 5 seconds, 6 seconds before tree impact. Such GPWS output should have triggered visual and oral warnings in the cockpit. Okay, so let's just have a look. So I'm going to stick the GPWS there, and I'm going to, how shall I stick it inside? Can I fit it in there maybe? Make it look, yeah, it's a bit of a mess, bit squashed. Let me stretch this down a little bit, make it look a bit more smart. There we go. There we go, so I've put it in the control structure. So we've got a GPWS and its output should have triggered visual and oral warnings in the cockpit. So let's have a look. So we've got a GPWS, it should provide some feedback to the crew, and that feedback should be GPWS, oral and visual warnings. Is that right? Visual and oral warnings. Visual and oral warnings. There we go. Right, so you'll notice the way that I've modelled this, you'll notice that I've put it from an arrow, feedback arrow, from the GPWS to the flight crew directly. Now, logically, from a very simple control structure perspective, we can do that. But but there is the potential consideration that feedback path is actually implemented by the aircraft itself, the aircraft human-machine interface. So not directly from the GPWS, but via an intermediary, which is the aircraft itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a dotted line like I've done the autopilot, and I'm going to steal that and I'm going to put it over here like this. So again, it's the GPWS oral and visual warnings from the aircraft itself to the pilots. So again, there's the consideration that, why is it doing that? Come on, Miro, what are you doing? There's the consideration that it may not be an issue with the GPWS itself. It may be to do with the feedback path from the aircraft to the crew that we need to investigate, we need to consider. But of course, the GPWS needs information. In fact, let me just delete that bit there, because I don't know if it provides information to the aircraft unless it's just information to the data recorder and information for the oral and visual and oral warnings on the flight deck human machine interface. But of course it's going to need information from the aircraft. One of those is altitude or ground proximity. There we go. So it's going to need that information to be able to make a decision to provide an alert. So if it should have triggered visual and oral warnings, why didn't it? Why was that feedback not provided? Why was that control action not provided? Is it an issue with it didn't realise it was too low? Was it not set up, configured properly? Were there issues with its control algorithm decision making? Were there any issues with the GPWS providing signals to the aircraft itself, perhaps. So maybe it knew and it was trying its hardest, but the aircraft was not providing that information to the crew. At the time the first version of the CVR transcript was produced from analog recording, the attendees agreed that there was a pull-up that sounded like a synthetic voice at the last seconds of the recording. So the FDR data showed the GPWS bit was on for 5 seconds. So let's have a look. GPWS bit. GPWS bit on 5 seconds. There we go. So that was on. And that was captured on the FDR data. And then we've also got a pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up. And how many seconds was that, was it? The last seconds. Okay. So the pull-up sound was recorded in the CVR, or 1 second after tree impact. This event was 2 seconds after GPWS bit was off. The sound was a rapid tempo and it was not initiated with whoop whoop. Not initiated with whoop whoop, as it should be in the GPWS oral warning. The pull-up sound was not identical in the length and tempo of the standard GPWS warning sound. Therefore, it is concluded that the sounds like pull up is identified as a human voice and did not come from the GPWS. Okay, so interesting. Let's just go back to here. So that was not provided. So the GPWS bit was on for 5 seconds, 6 seconds before impact. Okay. And there was no so it should provide visual or oral warnings, but there was no GPWS oral warning. This event was 2 seconds after GPS bit was off. Okay. Therefore, it is concluded that sounds like pull up is identified as a human voice and did not come from GPWS. In a normal operating condition, the pilots would not select flap override unless there was a problem with the flaps. However, even if the selector was on flap override, the warning too low gear should have been produced by the GPWS. So no GPWS. One oral. Too low gear. Why does it do that? There we go. Let's have a look. Should have been produced by the GPWS because at 6:31:26 the aircraft was already at 500 feet radio altitude and descending down. This low gear warning was not heard on the CVR either. This is really interesting. This is really interesting because it should have been produced. So there should be one of those. at 500 feet altitude, so altitude ground proximity, but it was not heard. Okay, so before we sort of continue then, let's just have a think about this through the control loop perspective. And again, the ground proximity warning system is going to have its own algorithms, control algorithms and decision making. And it's going to have some beliefs. And so in the case of the oral warning, pull up, the control algorithm, the decision making that decides when to provide pull up, will need a process model or some beliefs which will be based on some kind of feedback, which is to do with the altitude and perhaps the trajectory of the aircraft. I don't know how complex this system is. But if it's just about altitude, there'll be a limit below that alert is supposed to go off. So if it hasn't gone off, is that because there's an issue with the GPWS system not providing it? Or is it that it knows that it's below that altitude, but for whatever reason, issues with the algorithm decision making, it's decided not to do it? Or is it that it hasn't got the feedback it needs? It doesn't know that the altitude is too low. Is that one of the causal scenarios we need to think about? And then the same for too low gear. So again, it's that's a slightly different algorithm, but it's based probably on the same process model. So if the altitude is not too low for gear, if it believes it's not too low, then that's one of the explanations why it probably didn't provide a GPWS oral warning. So I'm hoping you can see that when you think about things through the lens of STAMP and the control loop, you can sort of find all manner of different potential scenarios to think of. And as part of your investigation, you're going to have some evidence available. But also when you do the analysis, you're going to be like, well, hang on. There's a couple of questions here that we need to answer. Let's go and ask the questions. Let's talk to the manufacturer, the designer. Let's go and look at the evidence we've got. Are there any other bits of evidence we need to collect? Do we need to do some testing? I think there was a mention in this report earlier on or somewhere else that they did some simulator training and it didn't behave as they expected it might do or something like that. So yeah, that's interesting. And again, the autopilot disengagement oral warning was not provided. So if they're two different systems and they're both supposed to be providing warnings and cautions, and they both didn't, they were not recorded on the cockpit voice recorder, then that raises questions over perhaps the human-machine interface between the A300B4 and the flight crew. Are there some human-machine interface avionics issues going on? So let's have a look then. So Mode 2A warning envelope. According to the aircraft flight manual, and we've already, aircraft operation manual, the warning mode 2A, flap up and landing gear retracted, is the appropriate mode for the situation of the last moments of the flight. The graphs showed that at the outer boundaries of the Mode 2A envelope, no warning will be generated if the radio altitude exceeds 2,500 feet. So if we've got a radio altitude there, look, on that bit of feedback and this bit of feedback here. So they could be the same feedback paths, they could be shared, or they could be independent, I don't know, maybe from different sides of the aircraft maybe, I don't know. It does say radio altitude though, doesn't it? So let's just make a note of that, radio altitude there, look. Radalt, radio altitude, there we go. So not pitot-static related. Exceeds 2,500 feet, or if the terrain closure rate is less than 3,500 feet. So we've got 2,500, so it's anything above that, it's okay. And then if the terrain closure rate is less than 3,400 feet per minute, so there we go. If it's less than that, it's okay. If it's above that, it should alert. If it's below that, it should alert. The following analysis is focused on the radio altitude lower than 1,750 feet, since the accident aircraft was flying at speed well below Mach 0.35. Within the last minute, the FDR data showed a number of radio altitudes which do not fit. Oh, here we go. Which do not fit into the general pattern. In these cases, the radar altitude indicated an altitude of around 3,320 feet. Sorry, 320 feet, while the certified limitation of the rad alt is 2,500 feet. According to the GPWS manufacturer, all right, let's stick them in the control structure, because why not? Let's put them there. GPWS manufacturer. There we go. Put them up there. One of the other tips I've got as well. When you're building your control structure model and you're reviewing the information, it is recommended, like highly recommended, that whenever you highlight, whenever you recognize a candidate controller in your information, highlight it, and then highlight it in a particular color unique to you or however you work, to remind yourself that you've identified that as a candidate controller, and then if you've put it in your control structure, then mark it in a color to remind you that you've already captured it in your control structure. Because of course you're going to find things that are mentioned many, many times throughout your investigation information, your report, and you're going to get lost because there's so much information. So it's always a good idea to leave yourself breadcrumbs. Where did I find, where does this candidate controller originate from in my information source? Have I put it in my control structure model? And then when you look at your control structure model, where does that candidate controller originate from? Because honestly, you're going to get lost if you don't keep track of where these things come from. And so what I recommend you do is you create a list, a database of candidate controllers, give them a unique reference number, and then include a reference to specifically where that has originated from. And if it's mentioned in a few different places in the same document or different documents, then just try and keep a track of where it's mentioned, so that whenever you do look at your control structure model, you can identify its origin and go straight to where it's first discussed, and that'll save you a lot of time, a lot of headaches. So like I said, I've included the GPWS manufacturer and I've made it an orange color. If it's a candidate controller, I usually use yellow, but orange is a bit more firm than yellow. So, and I've included it in a model, so I'm going to mark it as orange. That's just a bit of a helpful tip, really. You don't have to do that. You can tell me to, just ignore what I'm saying. It doesn't matter. But I find personally it helps me to keep sanity and traceability of where this information has come from, so that I can retrace my steps. Because you will forget. You will forget. If you come back to it in 6 months' time, somebody says, well, where's that come from? Why have you added that? You can go back and explain it to them and justify it. Okay, so the GPWS manufacturer, such phenomenon is nuisances called radio altimeter out of track, in which the warning activations are inhibited even though the closure rate is, oh my God, even though the closure rate has entered the warning envelope. Right, so it's not doing what it's supposed to do then. So there's a feature of this design, whether it's a failure or dangerous success is irrelevant. It's a feature of the design that it provides nuisances called radio altimeter out of track, in which the warning activations are inhibited even though the closure rate has exceeded the envelope. Okay. The terrain closure rate. Hang on a second, I want to clarify something. This doesn't make sense. Okay, so are we talking about a radio altitude, a rad alt, which in this case is this one? So if it's below 2,500 feet, you won't get if it's above 2,500 feet, you won't get a warning. So in this case, it's 3,320. So yeah, Oh, hang on a minute. The graph showed at the outer boundaries, no warning will be generated if the altitude exceeds 3,000 feet. Let me just get rid of these confusing crosses and arrows. So if it's above 2,000 feet, no alert, no alert, no warning. There we go. Will be generated if the radar exceeds 2,500 feet, or if the terrain closure rate is less than 3,400 feet. So if it's less than 3,400 feet, you get no alert. Okay, right, so what we've got is that the data showed a number of radio altitudes which do not fit into the general pattern. In these cases, the radio altimeter indicated altitude around 3,320 feet. So this is why you don't get an alert if it's 3,320 feet. According to the manufacturer, such phenomenon is nuisances called radio altimeter out of track, in which the warning activations are inhibited even though the closure rate has entered the warning envelope. So it's that bit there that's confusing, because we're either talking about an altitude or we're talking about a closure rate. So right, so the algorithm, it sounds like the control algorithm for the GPWS is not about one or the other, it's a combination of the two. So it seems to imply that if warning activations are inhibited because you're above the altitude, even though the closure rate is above 3,400 feet per minute. But a few minutes ago it said 900 feet per minute was the descent rate. So anyway, let's keep reading. I think we're sort of jumping ahead there. Let's keep going. So the terrain closure rate was calculated by multiplying the difference between the valid radalt data from 2 consecutive time frames by 60 to give a feet per minute. So it's 2 frames. Yeah, okay, all right. During the last minute of the flight, there were 6 occasions where terrain closure rates higher than the Mode 2A envelope were reached. The GPWS manufacturer indicated that such nuisances would be filtered, okay, by the GPWS. Yeah. Using the FDR data, the manufacturer simulated the system's responses using their GPWS simulator software and hardware in the loop for the type. The simulation results indicated that the warning inhibition due to radio altimeter being out of track lasted for about 3 seconds. 3 seconds. After the fault, excessive rate was emitted. Therefore, there should be no warning for event 1 and 2, which was less than 3 seconds from the nuisance. The simulation for the normal mode showed that on the 4th event, 14 seconds before tree impact, the system should have emitted terrain, followed by a whoop whoop pull-up warning. Okay, so let's just go back to our control structure. So it should have been, let's have a look. GPWS oral warning, terrain. Why is it doing that? There we go, terrain. And then whoop whoop pull up. There we go. Yeah, okay, so it should have done that. The FDR data showed that GPS warning bit was on for approximately 5 seconds. Starting from time frame 1131, that is 2 seconds after time frame 1129, where the terrain closure rate enters mode 2 envelope. However, the CVR recording did not reveal any warning, as would be expected. So there was So this was behaving as designed. There was no warning because it was designed to inhibit the warning. Okay. The tasks in the functional check are intended to detect the deterioration or potential failure of a system component or part installed on the aircraft. These tasks should be able to detect the potential failure due to zero drifting of semiconductor in the specified time interval, where the inspection time interval of functional check is C-check or equivalent of 1 year calendar time. In order to increase the safety and reliability of the GPWS, it is recommended that the functional check can be categorized as a mandatory item if Service Bulletin 340121 has not been applied. Okay. Something fishy about that. Something interesting about that algorithm for the GPWS, and that its susceptibility to warning inhibition. Because it's behaving as it's designed. It's supposed to inhibit the warning, but in this case it's inhibited it in a way that seems to have not given the crew maybe the time that they need to be able to save the day. I don't know, maybe I'm misinterpreting it not right. You know, let me in the comments what you think. Okay, so the A300-600 to the A300-B4 pilot conversion training approval. In the situations depicted in Chapter 2.5, Situational Awareness, let's have a look. 2.5, Situational Awareness. Right, let's just steal one of these. Let's make it a nice yellow. There we go, let's put it there. Situational Awareness, Transparency. Stretch it across there. There we go, and then I duplicate that, and then I need a nice arrow. Let's make an arrow. Where's the arrows? Arrow, arrow, arrow between there and there. I don't want it to be that. I want it to be grey. I want it to be thin. And I don't like that arrowhead. Personal preference. Right, there we go. Chapter 2.5, Situational Awareness. Let's just mark that up. Situational Awareness, what does that mean? There's a big discussion we could have about that. Anyway, where the pilot in command was intensely focusing his attention to the lateral position of the aircraft in instrument meteorological conditions, it was possible that he tried to seek data and or information that he used to gain and read on the A300-600 aircraft instruments he previously had flown, which were not available on the A300-B4 aircraft he was flying at the moment. The pictorial navigation display, see figure 9. Okay, let's have a look, figure 9. Oh, let's steal that one. Take it over there, figure 9. Where is figure 9, everybody? Let's have a look. It's over here somewhere. Figure 23, there's figure 9, look. Figure 9. So this is the A300-600 navigation display, and this is, yeah, hang on, is that the new one? The old one, A300-B4 horizontal situation indicator. So the one on the left is the aircraft they were actually flying, and the one on the right is the one that crew member was used to using. And they're quite different, as you can see. So will significantly enhance the pictorial navigation display on the Dash 600 will significantly enhance the crew's situational awareness, during high workload situation. It seemed at the time of the occurrence, the pilot in command had presumably lost his orientation, presumably lost his orientation regarding the position of the aircraft, partly due to the absence of a pictorial navigation display, figure 8, which he then had to transfer into his mental picture in his mind. So thinking about control loops again, so you've got a human-machine interface, the pilot has to acquire it, they have to then make sense of it, get that information in their mental model, and then of course they've got to use that mental model to understand where they are. And that's not easy, especially under high workload or in potentially stressful conditions. This mental picture which was later on had to be manifested into a preset mind for matters he had to anticipate, may have been a significant factor in determining his subsequent actions, i.e. the crucial issue of turning left or right. Therefore, the approval of the training program, so let's just have a look a second. So we had, is it this one? No, it's not. There's another control structure we started building, which was about the different aircraft types. Where is it? Where is it? Come on. It's around here somewhere. I could have sworn I'd built it. I think I'm going crazy, aren't I? Yes, I think I'm going crazy. I could have sworn I built a control structure already for it. Well, yeah, just quickly, let's zoom in. So this is the A300B4 cockpit instrumentation, as you can see there. And then we'll move on to the A300-600. So you've now got some displays, navigation displays, which are more advanced than the previous version. So you don't have those. You have the horizontal situation indicator, if that's what HSA, I can't remember. And then of course you've got the more advanced navigation display. So if you're used to using, your iPhone on the dashboard of your car, and you return to a 2005 vintage sat nav, of course you're going to run into challenges with that. And so the training program to go from the new one to the old one has got to be, pretty good. And so the control structure that I thought I'd built, that I've evidently not, I'm sure it was to do with the airline. There was an airline control structure model. Where is it? Is it this one? Organisation of, yeah, there we go, look, the organisation and management. So you've got the forward-facing cockpit crew. It's a different version. So the B4 fleet was a special version with a two-man crew cockpit, forward-facing cockpit crew, slightly different than most other operators that had a three-man crew cockpit. So it's already a more complex, operating condition. You're supposed to, well, you normally would have three, but there's two on this one. So there's already an interesting workload question there. But then, of course, there's the conversion training between the two. And they needed 2 ratings. So you've got an A300B4 commander held a double rating, which enabled them to fly the A300-600. Yes. So let's just have a look then. So shall I quickly knock one up? Should we do it now? Yeah, why not? Let's do it. Let's do it now. So we've got an A300-B4. And we've got some 600s, A300, 600, and they're the newer sort of design, if you like. So there we go, you've got 2 aircraft. You're going to have, let's have a look. I could have sworn I'd done this already. You're going to have a flight manual for 2 aircraft. You're going to have some training. Let's have a look. So we've got some crew, flight crew for these 2 aircraft. There we go. And we're going to have some flight crew training for these crew. And of course this training has to be specific for the particular aircraft that they're going to be operating. So there we go. I'm just quickly drawing this model just to make the point. So when you're thinking about these things, because ultimately the interactions that the flight crew have with the aircraft are broadly the same, but the specifics are different. Like the feedback that the crew will get from the aircraft is not the same, not exactly the same feedback. It will functionally be similar, but not exactly the same. So if you take this flight crew, let's make them green, and sorry, not that way, it's the other way around, isn't it? If you take this flight crew and you copy them, essentially paste them onto the other aircraft so that they can now fly either of those 2 aircraft. They've essentially got mental models, process models, beliefs about one aircraft, and you're asking them to use those same beliefs potentially on the other aircraft, which might not be appropriate. And then of course you've got their control algorithm, their decision making, which for a pilot, you aviate, navigate, communicate, but when you're talking about the specific operation of a specific aircraft, there are some different things that might need to be done. Maybe there are different limitations between the 2 aircraft that they have to think about. So in terms of flight crew training and qualification, we've got to make sure that we address those things and we don't just, give them some basic handover and then there you go, it's an aeroplane, you're a pilot, go and fly it. I hope that sort of makes sense. I'm just trying to sort of give you some ideas, some thoughts. So let's put this over here. There we go, flight crew training. Therefore, the approval of the training program. So I'll training program. There we go. And then you've got the approval of it. Hang on a second. Training program approval. So they need some information about the program and whether it's any good. And then of course they need to say whether they approve it or not. So let's put that on there. Ooh. Approve training assessment. I can't spell. There we go, training assessment. There we go. Hope that makes sense. If you've got any questions, please shout out, let me know. Okay, so the approval of the training program, because I've put the training program in the control structure, I'm going to put that in there. Has to consider the difference between the amounts of cognitive processing required and interpreting the information presented in the 2 display types. Okay, so that's an interesting point. Fantastic. Okay, so we're down to the last 3 pages, but I'm looking at the clock. It is 20 past 8 local time. So I think what I'm going to do is have a rest and we'll come back and do the last 3 pages on another live stream. I don't know the date yet. I'll have to figure a date out and let you know, but it'll probably be before the end of the week. And then once we've gone through that, you're welcome to ask any questions. Write them down, either email them, direct message them to me directly, or stick them in the chat. Or likewise, if you want to visit my website, I'll just put my website on screen so you can see it. You're welcome to visit my website at whiteley-safety.co.uk. I'll just stick that in the chat. And then you can contact me, press the I need help now button, and you can type in a message there, let me know what questions you've got, and we can set up a call and have a conversation about it. As I mentioned the other day on a previous video, I have been invited to speak at a Safety Critical Systems Club event next week. which is the Safety Critical Systems Symposium 2026. I'll be talking on the Tuesday about complexity, addressing complexity using STAMP, control structure models and STPA hazard analysis. Of course, if you're going to be there, ask me some questions. If you're not, I'm sure there are tickets available, so you're welcome to share that. And as I said, there are a lot of fantastic speeches next week. It's going to be really great to see everybody and hear what they've got to say. But anyway, with that said, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next live session. Take care. Bye-bye.